Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about Molgoth, which is the next boss in the Aberrus raid coming out in 10.1. All of this footage is from the second day of PTR testing, so obviously all of this is subject to change, but hopefully this will give you a brief understanding of how the fight works. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into the mechanics. Alright, so when entering the encounter room, you'll be faced with two bosses, Krosgoth and Moltania, each with their own damaging aura that applies a debuff, Corrupting Shadow for Krosgoth and Blazing Heat for Moltania. Both of these auras have a 40-yard range from the boss, so in order to make sure you're not getting both of these stacks at once, you'll need to spread these bosses out. There is a potential cheese strat that might be used, but I'll mention that at the end of the video. Also, even though I couldn't find anything about it in the dungeon journal, if you stack these two bosses together, they will apply their debuff much faster than if you pull them apart. Next, we'll talk about the Krosgoth specific mechanics, starting with Umbral Detonation. This will be targeted on several players. Simply take this out of the group, wait for it to go off, and then get out of the void zone it leaves behind. Next is Shadows Converge. This will summon a bunch of purple orbs that will get pulled in towards the boss. Make sure you're dodging this, otherwise you'll take damage as well as an additional stack of Corrupting Shadow. Next is Coalescing Void. This will put down a gravity well that pulls in all players. You take less damage the further you are away from it, so make sure you're running against its pull. I put off talking about the tanks until now because both Krosgoth and Moltania essentially have the same ability, doing some damage as well as applying an additional application of their respective debuff. Next up is Molten Eruption. This is a soak mechanic that should be soaked by one player. If no one is in the soak, then all players instead are damaged. Next up is Fiery Meteor. This seems to be a group soak mechanic, but it was doing so little damage to the tanks, they were able to solo it on PTR. Expect this to be a group soak though. And finally, Swirling Flame. Moltania will face a player and send out pillars of flame that need to be dodged. Once either Krosgoth or Moltania reach 50%, then they form into Molgoth. Molgoth's health will be determined on how far you've gotten each of the bosses down. For instance, if one is still at 100 and the other one is at 50, then they will be averaged out to 75. Molgoth also has empowered versions of all the abilities that we've talked about so far, as well as his own unique debuff that will continue to tick up throughout the rest of the fight until he either dies or you do. For the sake of brevity, I won't go through all the mechanics again, just note that the ability that drops a Void Zone will now also spawn Pillars of Flame, and the Group Soak mechanic will now also spawn a Gravity Well that needs to be run out of. Also, the tank mechanics have changed in this phase. Molgoth will cast two abilities back to back, the first one being Crushing Vulnerability. This will put a debuff on one of the tanks, increasing their damage taken to Shadow Flame by 200%. Immediately after that, Molgoth will begin to cast Shadow Flame Burst, which is a frontal cone. The tank not affected with Crushing Vulnerability needs to taunt the boss and face this away from the group. Alright, so that's enough mechanic talk, so let's talk about how I believe this fight is meant to actually play out. Obviously this stuff is subject to change, but for right now this is what it seems most obvious to me as to how this is going to work. So basically you'll want to split up your raid group into two separate groups, one on Krosgoth and one on Moltania, and then from there you're just dealing with each individual's mechanics until you need to swap because the debuff is getting too high, and this for us was being dictated mostly by the tanks because they were getting absolutely trucked by damage. So they were having to switch before anyone else in the group was really getting too troubled by this debuff. So what they'll need to do in order to deal with that is they'll move the boss to the center of the room, each will taunt each other's bosses, and then pull it back into their respective groups. And from there you're just repeating that process until you get one or both of them down to 50%. Also, you should probably avoid doing these tank swaps while Moltania is doing one of these soak mechanics or is about to do one of these soak mechanics, because if it goes off in the middle of the room, it can make it really difficult to figure out who's supposed to actually be soaking him, so always try to avoid that overlap. I mentioned earlier that you might be able to cheese the debuffs on the mini-bosses earlier. Basically what that looks like, and it was working like this on PTR by the way, though I don't know if this is necessarily how Blizzard wants it to work, but what you'll do is your ranged and healers will kind of stack towards the middle of the group, being towards one of the mini-bosses, and then just like one step out of the range of the second boss, and only stepping into the range of the second boss anytime he's not pulsing out that aura debuff application. So essentially, you'll be able to hit both of the bosses in range the entire time, cleaving between the two of them, and you would only just step out like 1 foot anytime he pulses out that aura. So you will need some sort of weak aura to track this, or boss mod to track when he's actually going to be applying that stack. And I don't think this is the way that Blizzard wants it to work, but there is precedent for this. This is something that you could do on Mythic Eye of the Jailer, so it has been seen in the past. So take that as what you will. Maybe they'll make changes to it, but right now there is a way that you can cleave both of them and avoid getting that second stack. So I do think it's worth mentioning. Once those two bosses form into Molgoth, the fight does get much easier, at least at first. He still has that stacking debuff, and now there's no way to clear it, which means this will serve as the soft enrage for the fight. So the way I think this boss is going to work is you'll want to try to get both of those mini-bosses down to 50% around the same time, so that when it forms into Molgoth, you're starting at 50%. And then from there, you'll probably want to use Lust, and then just burn him down as quickly as you can. Pretty straightforward fight overall. Right now, at least on PTR so far, it's been very heavy responsibility on the healers and the tanks, because those are the ones that are suffering most of the damage. Everyone else, you're just kind of avoiding the very straightforward mechanics. So we'll see how it gets tuned and how it plays out, but for right now, a very straightforward fight, basically coming down to the timings of when the tanks are switching, as well as just making sure you have healing cooldowns in the right place and no one's missing soaks or anything like that. So that's pretty much it for this fight. If you have any questions about it, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. I stream at Twitch at twitch.tv/ridmark, where I'll be doing all of the testing live, so feel free to come check me out there. So other than that, guys, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video.